So now, let's go ahead and start building the strings test page out. So if we go to the API documentation for Leafly, for strings, we have the following 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 options available. We can post to the /strings endpoint and get back a search results about the strings that we searched for, or all of the other ones require what they're calling a slug, which indicates which of the strings you're requesting details, reviews, pictures, availability, etc. for. Locations is very similar, where we can search for the locations using latitude and longitude along with some other filters that we can specify. Or we can specify a slug to get more information about a specific location. So we're going to be testing out the strains. So we'll start with the strain search. Now, in this example, they just have a body parameter which takes all the options that we'll be posting. It's not very useful. So we're going to go up and look at the documentation, and we can see what are the things that we can put into our strain search. One other thing that's very common for a public API that you can consume is to register your application with the API provider. Leafly provides out 2 pieces of information to you when you create an account with them. The first is an application ID, the second is application key. These are both very common things to do, and you'll see that if you want to integrate with Google or Facebook or Yahoo. For sign-in, they do the same thing. You register your app with them. They'll give you some keys that you can use to identify that it's you. And then they'll typically also restrict what domains can be the origin for that request. So all the requests that get sent to the Leafly API must contain this app ID and app key in the headers. So we'll go ahead and add those as inputs to our page. Now, since every request is going to require these pieces of information, this is a good candidate for control. We'll say, here's a div representing a container for this control, and the pieces of functionality or behaviors that we have here are, there's an app ID, which is some sort of input text box, and then there's an app key, which also will be an input text box. So user can put in their app ID and app key, and that will be used in the request. Now, since this is going to be a common theme, we'll probably want to have a button that they can press that will allow them to load credentials from cache or save into cache. So I have a save button and a load button for saving and loading the credentials into the local storage. The other thing that we're going to have is the actual strain search control. And the strain search has a page and a take, which are both numeric, a sort and a search parameter, which are both strings, and then a filters object that takes a bunch of strings for inclusion or exclusion based on flavor, categories, conditions, tags, etc. So we'll add those. So we'll say page is a number type, take is also a number type, the search term itself that we're using to perform the search. This is a string. And how we want the results sorted is also a string. Now, the difference being sort only is allowed to have one of these 4 string values. So we might want to handle this as actually a selection dropdown. Let's go ahead and change this. Select option. And we have a very limited list of options, so we'll go ahead and just put them all here. And by default, we'll have rating selected as the sort option. Then we'll have the additional filters. As you can see, these options are effects to exclude, flavors to search, category is one of these 3, conditions is also a type, is a list of things that we can pick from, and so are tags and symptoms. If we look at the bottom of this page, see categories, flavors, conditions, symptoms, and tags are all fixed. Now, we will consider them to be fixed and work as though they're fixed for now, but we should also be able to query for these, and there is a way to do so, and we'll look at that later. But for now, we can assume that these are the fixed values. Though while these are the fixed values, they're not exactly user-friendly, meaning they're not cased well, and you might have just kind of long run together identifiers where they would otherwise be spaced apart, like lack of appetite and gastrointestinal disorder. So these are the values that we need to supply to the system for them to work, and they may or may not be the same as what we'd want the user to see, and in this case they're not. And like I said, there is a way to query for a nicer name to show the user, and we combine that into the drop-down. So for now, let's just take a couple of these and put them in the drop-down, and then later we'll look at how do we get the full list in there. Okay, so now we have a sampling of the various filters that are available. And we should be able to run this and see what the page looks like. Okay, not the prettiest thing in the world, but it should work. If we look, we have different flavors, categories, conditions, tags, and symptoms. Now we want these to be multi-select. And we want them to be showing at least a few things to start. Now we have multi-select available. So at this point we have the view, but it doesn't actually do anything, right? If we pick load or save, the buttons don't actually perform any action, and while we have the ability to fill in all this stuff, we don't actually have a way to perform a search or get any search results back. So let's go ahead and hook all that fun stuff up. So now that we're performing operations and actually handling functionality of the page, we're going to start writing some JavaScript. And I'm going to go through writing the JavaScript by hand first, and then we'll look at what it looks like to move it into TypeScript, and then use TypeScript for the remainder of the project. So at this point, one of the scripts that needs to control this page is for the app key and app ID save and load to local storage. So I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to say save credentials function, set some items into the local storage. So I'm going to call this the Leafly app ID, and its value is going to be whatever's in this value text box. Since we haven't got into the knockout part of this yet, where knockout lets us have data in the background that we work with, we would typically do something maybe with jQuery. I would add an ID onto this input and search for it and get its value and use that to set. If I were to do that, here's what that might look like. Alright, so we would use jQuery to say find the element whose ID is Leafly app ID and take the value. Do the same for the app key element. If either of them have no value, just return. We don't actually want to save that. Otherwise, go ahead and set the Leafly app ID to the app ID that we found up here, and same for the app key. When loading back the credentials, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look and see if there is an item in local storage with Leafly app key or ID as the name, and if so, get those items and load them back into their appropriate text box. And the way to tell if an item is in storage is to actually just say get the item and see if it exists. And say if the Leafly app ID does not exist, return. We can't actually load back credentials, so don't bother doing anything. Otherwise, get the app key and the ID and then set them back into their respective text boxes. And again, since we don't have knockout, we'll go ahead and do that using jQuery. Alright, so now we have these functions, but they don't actually do anything. So we'll make the clicks for the save and load buttons actually call one of the functions. Now that the buttons actually call their appropriate functions, we can go ahead and test it out. You notice I switched to Google Chrome as my browser default just because I'm more comfortable in Chrome. So I just opened the Chrome debugging tools with F12 so I could see if there were any errors. I'm just going to load in an app key and an app ID, some random stuff, and save. And I can check, did it actually save? It says there's 3 things in there. We can check out what they are. You can see it's saved, and this is my application insights thing. It's just unrelated, but Leafly app ID and app key are both saved into storage. So now, just make sure loading back works. I cleared both those out. I hit load, bam. If I put something different in there, load, bam.